Hello, Renee. We're going to take a look at your 5 characteristics posting and give you a little bit of feedback here. So let's call up the blog and jump right in. So the first thing that I would like to do is just kind of go through and see just how you have arranged all of the photographs. Believe it or not, this is one of those things that sometimes trips people up, and I realize that some other students may have had a little bit of trouble posting their images. It looks like you didn't have too much trouble at all. You've got everything sort of organized. I like your kind of squiggle here to identify the end of a category. Everything seems to be in order. Everything seems to be in alignment, and so on and so forth. So it looks like you had a pretty good experience there. Now, with these 5 characteristics, the reason that we approach them the way that we do is so that you can identify the various components. However, you're almost always going to be dealing with all of these 5 characteristics sort of simultaneously, sort of all at the same time. It's kind of like learning words, one word at a time, but in the end, you're speaking the whole sentence. Here, we're learning one component or one characteristic at a time, but then the idea is that when you're applying this information, this knowledge, this experience, that you're doing all of them sort of simultaneously. You're addressing direction, you're addressing overall intensity, you're addressing the temperature or the color shift or the temperature shift, contrast and hardness. All of these things are sort of ebbing and flowing together. We break them down the way that we did in this project because, of course, I want you to know them each and how they work. That said, if you look through these photographs, you can kind of see bits and parts of each one in all of them. By far, the most important or the most critical of the 5 characteristics is the first one, which is direction. And I call that the first one because it is almost always really going to be the first thing you consider. Where is the light coming from? The direction of light influences how the shadows appear. They influence the direction of the shadows, the direction of the highlights. They indicate to us sometimes even an emotive quality, whether we're talking about the subtlety of a shape or whether we're talking about the information. If we have a light kind of coming in from the front, which would be like position 2 or 8, kind of similarly to the front, or even position number 1, that is really going to give you a lot of information. It sort of gives the face of the subject a lot of light. But you'll notice as we come around, like here in position 4, as we come around on these images, you're going to see a bit more of this sort of short lighting, this sort of lighting only a small portion of the object. And what that does is it calls attention to calls attention to the photographer and where you have placed yourself in proximity to the light. Now, in this image, you've got things that are not in focus. You've got this sort of blurred background here, and then the areas that are in focus are right up in here in the other 2 spots. There's nothing wrong with this strategy. You really want to ask yourself the sort of question of what is it that I want the viewer to be directed toward when you are choosing focus, when you're choosing something that is in focus or not in focus in a photograph. the thing that is in most critical focus is going to be where the viewer looks first. So when you have this sort of almost contradiction, you place an object directly in the center of your photograph, and yet it's blurry, and then the objects toward the outer edge are in focus. You're presenting a really challenging scenario for your viewer. And that's not a terrible thing. What you're doing is you're asking the viewer to sort of accept this aesthetic. Now, you're doing a few things here that are working pretty well. You've got this very strong line, which is a diagonal, which is one of the only diagonals in this photograph. This diagonal is aiming us right at this object here. This object is somewhat in focus. And so what that's doing is it's leading our eye directly to where things are going to be in focus. You do have this area of high contrast here, which our eye is always going to want to kind of go back to. We're also getting the sense of atmospheric space or depth. One of the reasons I've asked everyone to sort of allow things to run off the edge in every one of these photographs is so that you create a sense of space. Now, you're doing it very well because you're allowing something to run off the top, the sides here. It's clear that we're not concerned with the object themselves. Who cares if it's a bottle? Who cares if it's a jar? What we're looking at is the way that light kind of plays with everything. Here again, you're looking at the right things. We're not into depth of field yet. At this point, we just are working with quality of light. And so the depth of focus and how quickly that focus falls off from foreground to background, that is going to be something we study in the next project. But here in program, most of the time, you're going to get kind of a middle of the road depth, which means you're going to get acceptable in focus, things that are acceptably in focus from the beginning to the end of your photograph. And then far off, as you can see way into the background here where the backdrop was, that's where you're really getting it to be soft. It's a beautiful sort of way that you're using the curve in this photograph. This is really, really quite nice. This is coming right from the front, right from position number 1. And you can see it's just what we would call like a broad lighting. It's not quite limb lighting, L-I-M-B. Limb lighting is where the light would be a little bit smaller. In other words, the light wouldn't be casting its luminosity on such a large area. It would be a little bit smaller. And what you would get is, if we look here on these edges and these edges, instead of it being sort of bright as the way they are, they would start to become dark. And what happens is that the light sort of can't make it all the way around because it's a little bit more narrow, a little bit like what's happening here in the limb. When you start noticing those things, you'll want to take note as to what kind of light produces those things, especially when you are new to lighting. New to lighting, you're going to really want to pay attention to where things are when you find something that really resonates with you. It's really important to be taking notes of that, because you may not necessarily be able to kind of break it down. Here we have position 7, which is a completely sort of sideways view. And what happens here is you're not getting any illumination in the background. Notice how that transforms the space completely in comparison to something like this, where you're somewhere on what, position 2 or something like that here. And here what you've got is this sort of darkness way up front, because the light hasn't actually hit these objects. The light is somewhere, I'm going to presume, over on this side of the image, kind of coming to the side. I can tell that because of the direction of the shadow here. This shadow right here tells me where the light is coming from. But these, they're dark, yet they are not totally black. You really are getting this sort of, again, the same sense of depth, and you're using the same strategy of having the soft focus object in the foreground, in the middle of the image, and in the foreground we have the focused images. Is a really interesting way to go about it. Here again, using something that's very in focus in the front and then allowing this to be sort of drifting off into out of focus as it goes. This is a very good example of a shallow depth of field, which your camera obviously hit on in this particular image. And you can see the focus falls from right here and only goes a few inches until it falls completely off. And the back end or the horizon here is completely soft. A really dynamic sort of light. This is coming from maybe position 4 over here, where the light's kind of coming from this direction. And this would definitely be short lighting. You're getting this beautiful, really beautiful sort of a glow on the end of this, where the light is barely hitting the edge of this. This is what really is the really kind of inspires me when I'm looking at photographs, is looking at where the lighting is coming from. And when, especially new photographers, when you start to see them discover things like, what if I do, something like this? And then suddenly you're seeing a beautiful result out of it. Here, what we see is you're getting these shapes almost fall off into complete abstraction by this point. The light is hitting this side, and there is no light hitting these at all. You have nothing to reflect the light back into the scene, and so therefore, what you're getting is this real abstraction here. If you were even closer in, like maybe your image was cut off like right in here, the shapes that we would start to see are just this and this and this. It'd really be an interesting kind of juxtaposition there. So pay real close attention to the edges of your photographs. And when you start to look at the overall picture frame, like you're using this edge very well, I'm not certain that this edge is really participating in the photograph as much as over here. So maybe if we cropped in just a little bit, or if we came in on this image a little bit more. Overall, this first project, it looks like you found a kind of a strategy here with the object sort of up front and then kind of passing through. You did that a few times here, and I think it's working for you. I like to see that you then kind of moved on from that and started to explore some other things. That's a good thing when you are doing these first projects. I don't know if this is your first experience with lighting or the camera that you're using and that kind of thing, but it seems like you're handling it fairly well. One of the things that I am noticing here as a kind of repeating thing is that you tend to have objects placed very close on the table and then nothing toward the back. We have like objects set very close and kind of middle distance away from us in the image, but then I haven't seen yet things really back in here, like very far away, and allowing them to just be back there. Really explore the entire set there where you have that available to you. See what kind of shapes, what kind of compositions can result from having a lot of depth in these still life images. One of the things about photography is that you can create these illusions of atmospheric depth, and what happens is the viewer may lose sight of just what scale it is that we're looking at. How big are the things that we're looking at, or how small are they? You can see what happens when we get into dual lights, when you get in a situation with a key light and then a fill light, especially when they are somewhat close in their luminosity, when you've got a light hitting this side and a light hitting this other side, and they're not quite far enough away from each other. You get almost this sort of this kind of, I don't know, it's a I think some people call it a butterfly effect, where you've got a dark thing in the middle here like this, and then it's bright on one side and bright on the other. It can be used to an advantage, but it's typically something that you're going to want to avoid, because it does set up a rather unnatural kind of lighting situation, and it interferes in a lot of ways with exactly where the light is coming from. You really want to establish that direction from the key light, and then when you add that fill light, only use it very subtly. Only use it with the utmost subtlety. Here is, you're doing a much better job with that. You've got the highlight here coming in, but then you have another light coming in from this direction, and so that is not interfering, and so you don't have that sort of centralized kind of butterfly look, because the light is far enough away from each other. Also, really like what's going on here with the shadows on the object here. This object of real, like, kind of detail this close up, maybe it's interfering a little bit with us being able to view the entire image, because you got this wonderful texture going on right here, and then our eye wants to kind of get there, but then it's kind of difficult for us to sort of explore the rest of the image. In photography, it demands that we're kind of looking at the entire thing all the time. With drawing, it's a bit different. When we draw, we do pay attention to the entire plane. We do look at the entire page. Usually at one time, we're kind of maybe sketching out an entire composition over the whole frame. But as we begin to do that drawing, we're honing in on special areas maybe, and sort of writing in some details there, or sketching in some details over here. I would question whether that drawing technique is actually, the best way to do it. For some, it works really well. Coming from a photographic base, my drawing has always been where I've been looking all over the place, because that's what photography tends to be like. When you're looking through the viewfinder, it is very easy to start to look at a very small portion of it, like for instance, right down in here, to kind of isolate your eyes and say, this is really amazing. And you're doing a lot of work with how that looks and where the shadows are and so on. But then what can happen, whoops, keep bumping my, oh, there it is. Oh, where did it go? We'll find it. Let's use the arrows here. Boop, boop, there it is. But then in an area sort of like back here, again, I would ask you, how much is this participating in the rest of the composition? How much is it contributing to the rest of the composition? I think it's a good idea what you did here with the horizon and the darkness. That is establishing that sort of baseline back there and helping to sort of ground the image. But this might have been one of the cases where this object, if it was pushed farther back, if your focus was perhaps instead of right on the front here, if it kind of was trained a little bit farther back, we'd kind of be getting deeper into your photograph. So experimenting with where the focus is, and then as you're doing it, kind of making sure that you're looking at the entire edges of your picture plane at one time. It's a lot. It's a lot to kind of take in. Overall, I'm really interested in how you are using shadows on objects and in using objects to produce those shadows. It's very healthy for you to be doing those kinds of things. I think we could, improve a little bit on our critical focus. In other words, making sure that where your focus is exactly where you want it to be. That can be very difficult, especially if you're working with a new camera, or you're working on, a really small viewfinder, those kinds of things. That can be a real challenge. So, but I think it is one of the things where we want to kind of pay real close attention to, just where is that critical focus. Now I see here you're kind of using the same composition and moving the various lights around. It's not exactly what we wanted you to be doing, but we're fine with that. I would have been maybe a more enriching experiment had you been moving around the composition, moving things around and stuff like that. But nonetheless, you are here exploring with a massive variety of color tones here. This is just a sandbox here. What I'm interested in having you explore is the variety that you can achieve just by modifying the white balance and the color temperature of the light. By doing those two things, you can shift things. And what you'll notice is you're not limited to local color. You're not limited to local temperature. You can shift and manipulate that very, very easily using these simple tools. And it's a part of the characteristic of light, how warm or how cool it is, not necessarily local colors, meaning what color is the object or what is the hue of the object. We're talking about the luminance of the object and whether that luminance is a warm cast or a cool cast. But I think what you're doing here is good. Again, your focus is sort of on the edge over here, a little bit onto here. I think that would be an area that I would encourage you to look at even more closely as you continue with the next projects. Pay real close attention to critical focus. Now we're starting to get into some compositional kind of, I guess, character, because and this is typical. This is not typical, but this is not unusual, I guess I would say. It's the right time for these kinds of things to happen. You've been spending a couple of weeks shooting 3 different experiments kind of thing, and then we're in here trying to get into these other areas, and you're going to start to see compositional strategies happen a little bit differently. The first project, the first experiment here, where we just had the one light and the single objects, which were the bottles and jars, those are just shapes, and it is extremely pared down. The second one we did, if you recall, was the reflector. It was this one. And in this second one, you are using the reflector to bounce light back into the scene from the key light. You're not adding another light, you're bouncing light into the scene with a reflecting card or with other kind of device. And you can see how much different it is than the dual light. The dual light is a very complex kind of looking lighting, and it can get rather, I don't want to say muddy, but it can interfere with the direction of the light. When you're using reflectors like this, you're never going to have it interfere with the direction of the light. That's one of the main benefits to using a reflector over a fill light. When you use a reflector instead of the fill, what happens there is you're not adding any more luminosity to the scene. You're not adding more brightness to the scene. You're simply gathering the light that's been lost and throwing it back in. That light that you're throwing back in is always going to be much lower in intensity than the key light, so it's never going to compete with it. That's a good thing. That's really what we want that secondary sort of light to be doing. When we can't do it with a reflector and we have to use a fill light, we're almost wanting to simulate what we get from a reflector with that fill light. So I guess the takeaway there is always make your fill light much, much lower in intensity than your key light. Here, though, it looks like you're getting a little bit more comfortable even right away on this second project with these bottles. You've been shooting them, and so you're starting to figure out new ways or different ways to approach them. Here you're using some of the same strategies where you've got the in focus here, out of focus here, but see how different and how much more transformed this is than some of the earlier ones where it is simply a, let's go all the way back into one of these, somewhere in here. Let's see. Let me back all the way back out here just very quickly. Some of these, like for instance, this. So this image is using some of the same strategies, right? From the very first one, where you've got the objects on either side and then a soft focus here. And then by the time you get to this one, which is after, a week or so of shooting the bottles, see what happens. Suddenly you find an image like this, where this is really no more about the bottles. This is really about how the light is behaving off of these objects. And that's where we want to get to. The bottles are going to take care of themselves. The camera can record what the bottles look like. We don't have to try to make the bottles look like bottles. That won't be something that the camera has any trouble doing. What we want to do is focus on how the light is being transformed by that. And here what you're doing is you're getting into more of the design of the objects rather than the description of the objects. It doesn't matter that these are bottles. These are just organic shapes or geometric shapes. This is just direction of light. This is this sort of linear kind of space. This here, I'm glad that we have this one. This is what I'm talking about, getting that object a little bit farther away. This is pretty far away in comparison to this. And you can see what it's doing. It creates this long depth, really long depth. I will mention this right here, this little sort of rim, which creates this highlight. When you get objects like this is actually creates a high point of contrast, because this is really dark and this is really light. When you get this high point of contrast in the image, it's going to pull our eyes away from it. When you're looking at this as I'm talking, go ahead and close your eye and cover up this space. Kind of go like this, or kind of put your hand up on the screen like that to kind of cover this up, and you'll see immediately how quickly your eye can get back into here. Just by blocking that from your view, suddenly this whole half of an image starts to participate. This little gesture here, out of focus and everything, is pulling our attention away from it. It's like at the periphery of our eyes, and it's keeping us from naturally coming over here in the composition. That can be a strategy when we want to deliberately do that. But you need to know that that is a factor, so that when you don't want to do it, you can make sure not to do it. All of these things have to do with observation and what you're intending to do. None of this is meant to say this is right, this is wrong. This is to point out some of the things that I am observing and offering you some feedback on those observations. Like, here, I'm seeing this happen. This is what the visual consequence can be of that. We're getting really high in contrast here, using a really, really bright a key light here, and it's producing a really strong, harsh image. Let me get back to that shot. I keep using my magic mouse here. This is one of those cases where I'm not so sure this strategy is helping you out. Because this isn't really participating too much in the overall space. Here you've got this object pretty well isolated in the middle of the composition. It is more reasonably in focus than before. And with it only on this side, you don't have another object on this side, we're not getting that sort of balance of looking through, that kind of peering through something that we get when you have it on both sides of the image. It feels a little bit maybe like lopsided there, because you've got so much energy and so much weight over here, and then we can't get to this. You do the same exact thing, this time covering up all the way over to here with your hand, and see what we're seeing. To me, when I'm looking at, I'm really interested in all of this. This is so beautiful, Renee. Right here, you got this kind of pulling down in here. You get these wonderful shadows. You got all of this sort of dancing around back in there, this sort of repetition of circle. With I'm not sure we even need this part of the image, but cutting it off like maybe right here, if we were to cut that off, you'll suddenly see all of this becomes much more active in the photograph. Photography is a subtractive process. I don't know if I've said it enough times already. I have mentioned it, I'm sure, but photography is subtractive. You're continually going through the process of what don't I need when you're looking through that viewfinder. What don't I need? Is there anything else I can remove? Is there anything else that can be simplified? It's a process of reducing, and it doesn't always mean pulling things out. It could mean just shifting your camera forward or moving a light by a centimeter or two, or shifting that reflector. There's some subtle things that can happen, and you can transform the entire image that way. As far as the techniques, the steps of what you're doing, it's clear that you're understanding, or at least you're using all of the tools that we were accessing throughout the project. The tools themselves, that's the easy part. The consequence of using those tools, that's really what I'm talking about here. I hope you're picking up on that I'm speaking less about, the use of the tools, the use of the reflector, or the use of the scrim, or things like that, and more about what the image is doing and how it can affect the viewer visually. This is a language, and as I'm teaching you this language, I want to point out some of the consequences of using certain things over other things. Composition, it has its own grammar, it has its own syntax. We have negative space, just like you have spaces in between and pauses in between sentences. All of that plays a part in what you have to communicate and what the viewer will receive. This is a beautifully harmonious image that you've done here. It's really interesting. Some of the images feel less organized, and some of your images feel super duper organized. Like this one feels like really, like, wow, you got everything sort of lined up just perfectly. You can't move anything, even just a little bit, or it kind of comes out of place. You're doing these sort of interesting things where you're lining this edge up with the horizon. You've got this very nice soft light coming in with a softer light. You've got a secondary light over here. I'm not even sure that the secondary light would have been needed. Maybe if we had a reflector instead, that would have given you even a better kind of effect over here. But you got this running off the edge, which if it wasn't, we'd have two objects floating in space. I would even say that you might have even been able to come right up where this sort of inkwell would have been running off the edge as well. Putting my hand over that there, you'll see if you do that, immediately transforms the image once again. Some of these areas where you have lots of negative space, a graphic designer, for instance, would love you, because they can add text and they can add things into it. So there are times when you're going to want to have like lots of negative space like this, where you have an object, you have something else, and then there's a nice open negative space for a graphic designer to be able to put in their article in the magazine or in the paper or whatever. That is something that you would work with the writer, or you'd work with the designer already on. They may have even given you an idea of like, well, I need this much space in the image as you go out and collect what you need to collect for them. Again, the strategy of the forward in focus, backward out of focus, all of this is kind of a sort of characteristic of the image. And I think I was asking the group as we looked at these images whether we're seeing some sort of individual voice or some sort of uniqueness about this. And that would be one of the things that seems to be common throughout your collection here, is that you have objects that are close and in focus and on the edges, and then toward the center we've got out of focus and farther away. Experiment with that even more dramatically as you start to study depth of field and you start to study the characteristic of movement within your photographs and things like that. It's going to open up all kinds of new things for you. I hope you got plenty of good information here. I'm really excited about to see what you're going to do next. It's clear that you were enjoying yourself. As I moved around, I could tell that some students were really kind of getting into the project, or at the very least, it was sort of like ringing some bells. Not every project is going to do that. Not every component of every project is going to do that. That's okay. They don't have to. There are certain things that are just going to be a collection of skill sets for you. But I hope you continue to have the same enthusiasm in the next few projects. And I think you did an excellent job on this first one, given that it's probably your first go at artificial lighting, and maybe even your first real exploration of the camera that you're using. So that's what I have for you, and we'll see you in the studio. All right, bye now.